The sun shone brightly over the bustling city as a luxury car pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and out stepped a man who appeared to be in his early 40s. He adjusted his designer sunglasses, carefully inspecting the surroundings. His perfectly tailored suit, expensive leather shoes, and gleaming gold watch screamed wealth. His movements were smooth, like someone who was used to getting attention wherever he went. He glanced around, his expression a mix of disdain and boredom. The city was busy, with people moving in every direction, but none of that seemed to matter to him. He was here for business, but business meant more than just meetings. It was about status, and he wasn't interested in mixing with the common folk. He checked his phone for the time, frowning when he noticed he was running late. With a quick wave of his hand, he motioned to a nearby taxi. The car was a little old, but it had the bright yellow of a classic taxi. The man barely looked at the driver as he stepped forward. He opened the back door and slid into the car without a word. The driver, an older man in his 60s, had a weathered face but kind eyes. He greeted the tourist with a soft smile, but the man didn't acknowledge him. The tourist pulled his jacket tighter around him, already irritated. "I'm in a hurry," he said, glancing at the driver with a slight roll of his eyes. The driver nodded quietly, closing the door gently behind him. The taxi's engine hummed softly as the driver pulled away from the curb. The city streets were busy, but the driver seemed to know exactly where he was going. He navigated the traffic with ease, his hands steady on the wheel. The tourist, however, was already making his displeasure known. He looked around the interior of the taxi, scrunching his nose at the worn fabric of the seats. "Ugh," he muttered under his breath. "This car could use a serious upgrade." He glanced at the driver briefly, then looked back out the window, not even trying to hide his disgust. The elderly driver didn't react, he simply kept his eyes on the road, as calm and patient as ever. The tourist huffed and shifted in his seat, adjusting his position as if trying to get comfortable in a place he felt didn't meet his high standards. He pulled out his phone and started tapping furiously, making it clear he had no interest in small talk. But the driver, with a soft voice, attempted to break the silence. "Are you enjoying your visit to our city, sir?" he asked kindly, his tone gentle, almost welcoming. The tourist glanced at him with a look of mild annoyance. "It's fine," he said flatly, dismissing the question as unimportant, "just another business trip." He turned his attention back to his phone, where he began typing an email, completely ignoring the driver's attempt at conversation. The driver, unfazed, nodded. "I understand, it's always busy for people like you, I suppose." The tourist glanced at him for a moment, his expression one of complete indifference. "You have no idea," he replied. "People like me, we don't waste time, we're always on the move. You probably don't even know what that's like." The driver gave a quiet smile but said nothing. The tourist's words hung in the air, but the driver didn't seem bothered. He just continued driving through the city, the sound of the engine filling the silence between them. The streets outside were a blur of lights and movement, but inside the taxi, the tourist's mood only grew darker. He leaned back in his seat with a deep sigh, his eyes scanning the surroundings with disinterest. "This car smells," he muttered, wrinkling his nose. "It's like a mixture of old leather and what is that, stale air." He flicked his hand toward the air vent, as though to dismiss the unpleasantness. The driver, who had heard similar complaints countless times before, didn't respond. He simply adjusted the temperature slightly, doing his best to ensure the tourist's comfort, though the man didn't seem to notice. The tourist sat up suddenly, glancing out the window and tapping his fingers impatiently on the seat. "How long is this going to take?" he asked, his voice now tinged with annoyance. "Not long, sir," the driver said calmly, keeping his eyes on the road. "We're about 15 minutes away from your destination." The tourist scoffed. 15 minutes? This is ridiculous, I don't have time to waste in this car." He looked down at his phone again, his voice growing louder as he continued his phone conversation. "Yeah, the deal's almost done, just waiting on the final signature," he said into the phone, clearly relishing the opportunity to brag. "I mean, they don't even know who I am. I could buy the entire company if I wanted to. People like me, were movers and shakers. The driver's eyes remained focused on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, but the words didn't escape him. He had heard them before, spoken by others who believed their wealth gave them power over others. The tourist continued, oblivious to the man sitting beside him. Look, I don't want to be here all day. I've got meetings, interviews, important stuff. This is just a quick stop before I head to my private jet. I don't know why people like you think they can treat us like this. The driver remained quiet, as always. He wasn't bothered by the insults. It wasn't the first time someone had spoken to him this way, but still, the words stung. He had spent his life working hard, and yet people like this tourist couldn't see the value in someone who didn't have his wealth or status. Despite the tourist's rude remarks, the driver didn't let his emotions show. His hands remained steady on the wheel, his eyes scanning the road ahead with a quiet focus. It was as if the words didn't even matter. He had dealt with people like this before, and he knew how to stay calm. The tourist, on the other hand, was growing increasingly impatient. He shifted in his seat, adjusted his expensive jacket, and continued to glance at his watch. "This is taking forever," he muttered under his breath. "You don't know why people like you can't drive faster." The driver didn't react. He simply nodded in acknowledgement, his voice soft when he finally spoke. "It's better to drive safely, sir, than to rush and make mistakes. Safety is always the first priority." The tourist rolled his eyes and crossed his arms. "Yeah, right," he said, scoffing. "Safety, you're just slow." A few moments passed, and the driver continued to navigate the busy streets with a calm precision. Every now and then, he would glance at the rearview mirror, his expression unchanged. He didn't seem concerned or upset by the tourist's criticism. It was almost as if the man's words were just background noise to him, nothing more than a breeze passing by. "Where are you from?" the driver asked after a while, breaking the silence. His voice was warm, inviting even as he made one last attempt at friendly conversation. "It's not often I meet someone with such a busy schedule." The tourist barely glanced at him, clearly uninterested. "I'm from the city," he replied, his voice dismissive. "I don't have time to waste talking to people like you." The driver nodded politely. "I understand, sir, but I can tell you've worked hard to get where you are." The tourist let out a sharp laugh. "Worked hard? Please, people like me don't work hard, we get things done. The world revolves around people like me." He paused, looking out the window with a smug smile. "You'd never understand what it's like." The driver's smile remained gentle, but he said nothing. He knew it wasn't worth engaging in an argument. Instead, he just kept driving, taking the time to reflect on the world from his perspective. The taxi's engine hummed steadily as they approached their destination. The bustling city streets slowly gave way to quieter, more exclusive roads. The tourist leaned forward in his seat, glancing out the window with a look of satisfaction. He could see the tall glass towers of his hotel rising in the distance. Finally, he muttered, as if he'd been trapped in the cab for hours, "About time we get there." The driver, still calm, steered the car toward the grand entrance of an upscale hotel. The tourist's eyes narrowed. He didn't recognize the building, but it looked fancy enough. A 5-star hotel, probably, perfect for someone like him. The driver slowed the car to a stop in front of the lobby. The doorman, dressed in a sharp suit, hurried over with a warm smile to open the door. But just as the tourist reached for the handle, something caught his eye. The driver, without a word, stepped out of the car. The tourist blinked, confused for a moment. He had assumed the driver would simply wait while he went inside. Instead, the elderly man walked toward the hotel entrance with a purposeful stride. The tourist was taken aback. "What's this?" he muttered under his breath. "Is he leaving?" But before he could say anything, the doorman greeted the driver with a respectful bow. "Good evening, Mr. Harrison," the doorman said with a tone of deep respect. The tourist watched, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Mr. Harrison," he repeated, confused. "What? No way." The driver, now standing with a calm air of authority, turned and smiled briefly at the tourist. "Have a good evening, sir," he said, his voice still polite but firm. The tourist's mouth hung open as he watched the driver walk inside, nodding to the hotel staff as they greeted him warmly. The tourist sat frozen in the back seat, unable to comprehend what he had just witnessed. What was going on? Why was the driver treated like a VIP? And who was this man, really? As the driver disappeared through the doors, the taxi's engine idled quietly in the street, and the tourist was left to grapple with the mystery that had just unfolded before him. The tourist remained frozen in the back seat, staring at the entrance of the hotel. He couldn't shake the image of the driver being greeted with such respect. Something wasn't right. The doorman had practically bowed to him, like he was royalty. It didn't make any sense. Still bewildered, the tourist opened the door and stepped out of the taxi. He walked slowly toward the entrance, glancing back at the car, trying to make sense of what had just happened. As he approached the hotel lobby, he saw the driver, no Mr. Harrison, standing with the hotel manager now. The manager, a sharply dressed man in his 40s, was shaking his hand with great enthusiasm. "Mr. Harrison, it's an honor to see you again," the manager said, his voice full of warmth. The tourist's mouth went dry. "Mr. Harrison," he whispered to himself. Was that really the same man who had been driving him just a few minutes ago? The manager was still speaking to Mr. Harrison, his tone respectful and almost deferential. "We've prepared everything for your stay. I trust you'll find everything to your liking." Mr. Harrison nodded, his voice calm and collected. "I'm sure it will be perfect as always. Thank you for your hospitality." The tourist couldn't believe his ears. The driver, the simple old man he had dismissed as just another low-class worker, was being treated like an old friend by the hotel manager. He took a step closer, trying to listen in. But the moment Mr. Harrison caught sight of him, he turned and gave a polite smile. "Is there something I can help you with, sir?" Mr. Harrison asked, his tone still as kind and composed as ever. The tourist felt his stomach tighten. He didn't know what to say. This couldn't be happening. The man he had belittled and insulted was clearly someone important. But why hadn't he said anything? Why had he just kept smiling, and letting the tourist think he was just a lowly driver? The manager, noticing the tourist's confusion, turned to him with a knowing smile. "Mr. Harrison is not just the owner of this hotel, he owns several others around the world. He enjoys taking a step back from his usual life to remind himself of what it's like to interact with people in all walks of life." The tourist's face turned bright red. The tourist stood frozen, his mouth dry, unable to form a single word. His mind raced as he tried to process what he had just heard. The man he had ridiculed, the one he had treated with such disdain, was not only wealthy but was the owner of the hotel and many others around the world. He had thought of him as nothing more than an old taxi driver, someone beneath him. But now, it was clear that he was so much more. The tourist glanced at Mr. Harrison, who stood calmly with the hotel manager, a gentle smile on his face. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of regret, the weight of his arrogance sinking in. "I'm so sorry," the tourist stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He wanted to apologize, but the words felt heavy and awkward. He had been rude, dismissive and disrespectful, and now, it was too late to take any of it back. Mr. Harrison only smiled, his expression still kind. "It's quite all right," he said softly, his voice warm but with a hint of wisdom. "Sometimes we all forget that respect is something that should be given to everyone, no matter their job or status." The tourist felt his face flush with embarrassment. He had been so quick to judge, so eager to assert his superiority, without realizing how wrong he was. Now, standing in front of the man he had belittled, he felt small, almost insignificant. "I never should have treated you that way," the tourist mumbled, his voice filled with regret. Mr. Harrison gave him a slight nod. "Everyone makes mistakes, it's how we learn from them that matters." With that, the tourist stood in silence, his heart heavy with the lesson he had just learned.